All right. We are recording, and Dana, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. Lisa's driving the show of the tech behind the scenes. You all know Lisa Lavigne from our VSys VSys Voices bespoke software. And my name is Dana Litwin, and I'm happy to facilitate with our two other VSys Voices experts who are really, truly deep experience in this topic of disaster preparedness and how volunteers fit into that and how that fits into the policies you have or how policies might adapt in our times. And in particular, Jared McCannell is been deeply involved in government level, nonprofit level, disaster preparedness and response throughout his career. You can see our bios up on the screen if you're not already familiar with us. And he's also got some updated information. Some other colleagues and family members of his are still very actively involved with disaster preparedness, emergency planning. So there'll be time both for discussion with our experts and also questions for all of you who are participating if you have specific situations or concerns. And of course, Joan Cardellino has a long and illustrious career with healthcare and hospital settings, and because so many of the participants on these calls are from that sector, we recognize there's a lot of sectors represented today. Joan brings, again, that really deep experience and knowledge and wisdom in practicality of what the regulations are, because they're usually really strict and very different in a healthcare or hospice or hospital setting than they are in other nonprofit sectors. And because Jared and Joan are really the experts for this topic, I'll have answers if you want to ask me something directly, but really we've got some poll questions and some things to talk about to really dig in with all of you, and as people join in, they'll get involved as well. And if you don't have a mic and camera, that's fine. Have any questions as they come up in the chat box. You should be able to access that, and you can always message all of us if there's any kind of tech difficulties, you're having trouble seeing or hearing somebody, we can solve that as well. But let's dig right into it. Lisa, part of what we want to do is I'm going to have Lisa put up our first poll question and just see where, and Melissa's helping us with the chat too, thanks Melissa Bergen, but really where are you now? Like what situations are you all facing right now? So we'll have a series of poll questions, so just take a couple of moments to please fill this out, and we'll go into talking about how, once we kind of get an idea of these answers, of how prepared you feel like you are right now, if any other sudden crisis, in addition to the ones that we're already all dealing with, come upon you, because that's going to be handled, again, in states very differently, in regions or counties sometimes very differently, agency by agency very differently. A lot of you hopefully have a pretty solid emergency response plan, disaster plan, and if not, this is the session, this is the panel where you can really start to dig into those resources from our experts today, Joan and Jared, and each other. So that you know that you do not ever have to reinvent the wheel. There's always a template and a model of success in this area that you can use to build up your program if you feel it's lacking. But this kind of gives us this first poll question of, I think about 4 or 5 that we have throughout the session, really gives Jared and Joan an idea of where we can focus our discussion, because again, this is interactive, it's very flexible, and the content can absolutely be driven by all of you asking questions and putting forth specific scenarios and challenges that you would like some help solving for in this.
Dana, if I could jump in regarding the first poll question, you'll notice it was a little bit vague in the sense that it asked about mobilizing volunteers to help with a crisis. And to different agencies, that's going to mean different things. You might interpret that as, can we mobilize our volunteers to go out and help, the big crisis out there, handing out bottles of water or directing traffic? Or, how is it a crisis within your organization? Is a disaster that's happening affecting you? So COVID-19 certainly affected hospitals. And so, you know, those are two things I want you to keep in mind when we're talking. We're going to be talking about both of them. So it could be a little jumbled and confusing if we don't kind of set that tone right now. And so when you're thinking about your questions, guests, please frame it in those terms, you know, whether it's mobilizing your volunteers to go out and help, or it's mobilizing your volunteers and being prepared within your agency to help.
That's a really great distinction. Thank you, Jared. We have a few more, I think we have about 10 more seconds for everyone to answer the poll. Joan, did you want to piggyback on any of that so far?
Not yet. The only thing I'm trying to figure out, I'm going to disappear for a second and get the attendance list. We have everybody on the call from hospitals, because if hospitals have to mobilize their volunteers either internally or externally, it needs to go through the hospital chain of command. That's the only thing I would say.
Exactly. Yeah, and speaking to, there are very different situations for healthcare and regulations and tighter laws and all that. So looking at the results here, we've got, I guess the good news is that ABC, the overall majority is that we're able to respond in some significant way, so that's good. That speaks to that we probably have some plans in place in your agencies. A few, about a quarter can't answer, maybe people who are calling in or not using a smartphone or laptop access to be able to type things in or answer polls. You know, a couple of people on the call who would be unable to, or they're just not sure. And so, again, speaking to this mixed audience results, we can learn from the experts here, and we can also learn from each other of what's working for those folks who are prepared. Sounds good. So moving on, let's talk about, if you want to go to the next slide, Lisa. And actually, just kind of, there we go. So for those of you who have had to respond not just to COVID, but, you know, Joan and I are in California. We've had a lot of wildfires and smoke. We get earthquakes on the regular. There's been hurricanes. There's been a lot going on, power storms, derricos. So part of what we want to understand and talk about is, what would you do differently with the wisdom that you have right now? And Jared or Joan, do you want, if people have some specific situations or questions, again, you put that in the chat and we can respond to that. But Joan, I want you to dig in a little bit about how with that difference, that really important boundary between how healthcare works and kind of their structures and planning, because a healthcare agency is much more likely to have that plan very solidly in place and not very adaptable, versus some members of our participant audience today where they're in a nonprofit agency or different sector, whether it's food or animal care or other social services, that is a little bit more flexible. If you speak to that for a moment.
Well, hospitals are closed systems, and I still am trying to figure out if we have anybody on the call that isn't from a hospital. So if you put that in the chat, that would be very helpful as we tailor our comments. We're going to make sure we address everybody. And those of you that are on the webinar, if you are from a hospital, you know what I'm talking about when I say a closed system. You've got an emergency preparedness team that practices year-round. You've got an emergency manager. It's built into the DNA of every hospital organization to be prepared for no matter what. We drill, we practice. It might be the same as an organization such as Red Cross or those other types of emergency response organizations, but it's not the same as a Center for Performing Arts or a food bank. And some of you from those sectors were signed up. So when it comes to emergency response, from a hospital perspective, I just wanted to make sure we tailored this session with the understanding that you as a hospital volunteer leader will hear many great ideas. And Jared will go up and down the national, state, local emergency response volunteer structures and organizations. But certainly, you know better than I at this point that before you take any step in the direction of any of those ideas that we're sharing with you, it has to be vetted by your emergency manager. And so that's the difference between hospitals that are closed systems and other organizations that are open systems that have a lot more flexibility to just go with the flow and send their folks anywhere without a whole lot of rigmarole.
Exactly, and just so our participants know, we've put a lot of thought and discussion into this and framing that and understanding how hospitals versus non-hospitals and sector by sector is really different. As we have a poll up of who is on the call right now, who's in a hospital healthcare organization, yes or no. Jared, go ahead with your point.
Sure. I've got two things to follow up on. One, it's something that Joan said in her initial comments, which was the chain of command. That's a really important concept to understand. The last thing in the world we ever want to do is send volunteers into any situation, disaster or not, without, one, having them know what they're doing, two, making sure that other people actually need and want them there so they don't end up becoming victims themselves. And then the list goes on as to why you don't want what are called spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteers. So these are, your average do-gooder, oh my gosh, there's a big crisis, I'm going to go help out. And that actually makes the problem worse. It clogs up roadways, people get hurt, so on and so forth. So that whole idea of chain of command is really important. So your hospital inevitably has some sort of preparedness coordinator, or they might be your head of security, or they might have other titles, but it's someone that has that role. And if you get any federal money, which I almost guarantee everyone gets some through the form of Medicare, Medicaid, or things like that, you have to have a preparedness program. So my suggestion is touch base with whoever that is at your facility just to get to know them better and start that relationship. The next thing I want to share, so yeah, thank you, Joan. That was a great point. There's a chain of command, and it usually doesn't start with a volunteer coordinator. The other thing I want to mention about this first image here, what would you do differently? I've been involved in a number of emergency responses and incidents, and one thing I would say we always do differently is each time we learn from our mistakes, and each time we learn how we could do it differently. And there's a cycle to preparedness. You plan and prepare, and then something happens, an incident happens, that kind of impact point, and then you're responding. Now, most of us, our job isn't to respond. Our volunteers that regularly work in the hospitals, they're not first responders. To be there, and so on and so forth. Where we do end up kind of coming in handy is in the recovery phase. And so that's when the community has been taxed and, the resources are running low, but we're beyond the actual danger of the emergency. Now we're dealing with secondary issues like mucking out basements after a flood, or distributing food, distributing clothing, things like that after some sort of big incident. So getting in your mind ahead of time that, we're quite often more likely as community members, not necessarily hospital volunteers, but community members in general, you'll be more applicable during the recovery phase. And then that loops right back to the planning and preparedness part again, because inevitably there will be another disaster. So that cyclical nature of disaster preparedness and response is really important to understand. So if you've been through a disaster already, think back to that and what would have been nicer to have in place, and then build that into your future planning. The other thing is, the final thing I want to say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, you got it.
You may want to develop your own internal disaster plan of communication. How do you communicate to your volunteers when suddenly things are different? And that's something you can be proactive and you have control over. And then you can, go to your organization's disaster preparedness professional, whoever that might be, and, start to talk. Let's say, hey, I've been thinking about preparedness. I've got this communication plan in mind for volunteers. I was wondering if there's anything else we should consider. And that's a great start to this conversation. Go ahead, Dana, back to you.
Oh, yeah, no, that's perfect. And Scott brought up a great point in the chat that volunteer roles in crisis situations must be clearly defined. So that's what the point that Jared just made is, you can always fine-tune an internal by program response and make it really clear where everyone fits in the scheme of things. And we've certainly, both in 9/11 and hurricane response here in the Western region wildfire response, I've often worked with conservation agencies who've had to directly manage wildfires with our staff and volunteers or supporting CAL FIRE or other responders. And it seems like not just the internal messaging, but we can all contribute to the public messaging of that really crucial piece of don't show up unless you're invited or called or unless you're already part of the team, because it really does cause more disorganization and havoc than good. And also just randomly sending stuff that you haven't been asked to send is not ideal. You know, FEMA and Red Cross and others are always like, in any emergency situation, cash donations to specific funds that are vetted and set up for support is really the way to go. And, you know, a box full of teddy bears is just going to get in the way with good intentions.
And Dana, not to be morbid, but to make that point, that box full of teddy bears, there are warehouses in Newtown, Connecticut that are full of teddy bears. And that's tragic to think that, you know, that's how people responded, thoughtful, kind, and loving and all. But what are people in Newtown, Connecticut going to do with 700,000 teddy bears? You know? Yeah. Those resources could have been used differently.
Right. You know, and so go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Joan. I was about to invite you for your answers.
Hospitals are well aware of believe me, of the spontaneous donations, you might say, that people want to give, particularly because of the sick and those affected in the hospital, but not only them, but the staff who are there 24/7 and most times in lockdown when the biggest thing hits. So you'll find hospitals inundated with offers for these kind of things. And for the most part, they can't take them, you know, but they do. However, I do see volunteer departments being the pass-through and the coordinator, particularly during COVID. I see them being used more and more as the coordinator for those spontaneous donations. And that's how a lot of the volunteer directors I've watched over the country, many of their roles have been diverted to that. Can you imagine you have to use staff time to manage that tremendous outpouring so that things get to the right place? So when it comes to the spontaneous volunteers and donations, hospitals know about them. They know about them also during the holidays. You know, it happens all the time. But Jared, I wanted you to go back to, if you don't mind, can you describe for those on the call the Fed, state, county emergency response agencies? I don't know if we're jumping ahead, but I think that is information that would be valuable to the group on the call, because let's just make sure we're all on the same wavelength here about what's going on with emergency volunteering, and then we can turn to what can they do within that system that's already in place.
Sure, and that's a great lead into the topic in general, so I'm glad you brought it up. But there's a few things that are really important to understand about any disaster response. It is always managed, it begins and ends at the local level. So the state won't just declare an emergency without having individual towns or counties report up to them that there's some sort of problem. And so you know, if we'll get down as small as the town has some sort of emergency manager. They're usually a firefighter in most rural towns from personal experience. So that person assumes control or command of the incident, and there's kind of a hierarchy of whoever's trained the most, you know, can end up becoming that commander, that commander of the incident. When they've exhausted their resources, you know, there's no more ambulances, there's no more drivers, there's no more fire trucks, we've run out of volunteers, then they go up the chain to the next level, which is the county. And usually towns, they don't do a whole lot. They jump right to the county because they know they need resources. And then the county they assume the command of the incident. And when the county is taxed on their resources or becomes a, you know, a inter-county type of event, the state might get involved at that point. Then if it's a state-declared disaster, you know, the state takes care of it until they're exhausting their resources and they call in the feds. So FEMA doesn't just show up unannounced or uninvited. And that's an important thing to know. The other thing simply is that your hospital isn't in that chain of command. Your hospital is a resource to that chain of command. So it's not the hospital's responsibility to respond. When a local or state declaration is made, the hospital is actually giving up a certain amount of their rights to be part of that response. And that's an area that I don't really want to get into because it's kind of a 2.0 version of this discussion. But basically what I'm saying is the hospital is never the lead responder. They're a resource for the response. And it might seem like, no, we're in crisis in our hospital. Absolutely, that could be the case. But solving the crisis in your hospital might not necessarily solve the COVID outbreak all over the world, right? So it's important to know that stuff. If those concepts are still a little vague and hard to understand, there's a really simple training. It's a great thing to have on your resume from FEMA. It's free. There's hundreds of different trainings you can take through FEMA. They're all online. But it's ICS 100, or another name is NIMS 100. ICS is Incident Command Structure or Incident Command System, depending on who you ask. And that's the basic intro for when a disaster strikes, what happens, who's in charge, how do you respond. And the other classes that follow that just kind of build on that concept over and over and over. Then the other name for that is NIMS, and that's part of the National Incident Management System, NIMS. ICS is the basis of NIMS. That when you take NIMS training, you start out with ICS 100. So just for your own sake of understanding, how does a disaster unfold in our community and beyond? That's a great place to start. There is a volunteer management module in that training as well. Again, this is just the FEMA website. If you look up training on FEMA, you'll find it. And that's a real good training for folks that are part of that incident command, who are in charge of resources like community volunteers. That doesn't mean that you're going to be giving over your hospital volunteers over to the bigger cause necessarily. Of course, if they want to, there's ways to do that. But again, the point is your volunteers aren't necessarily the ones that are going to be running out into the streets helping. Chances are you need them where you are, or you're trying to reassign them into virtual roles and so on and so forth. So that stuff is really kind of important to understand. And Joan, I think I kind of covered what you're asking. I'm going to turn it back to you in case I didn't.
Okay, that's okay. So in my own world, I worked for Red Cross for 15 years, and I was on the streets with the DAT teams, disaster action teams. So I've had that kind of experience and that kind of understanding of how volunteers are used. It's different than hospitals. And again, I apologize to anybody on the call who's not from a hospital. We'd be happy to talk to you offline to address your individual needs. Since the majority are from hospitals, I want to say that one of the things we have found, and while I've been here in California, one of the things I did was work for at least 10 years at the state level with California volunteers. It happened when I first got here. There was a big emergency, and Schwarzenegger was governor, and he went to that emergency, and he said, "This will never happen again. We need volunteers. We need a streamlined infrastructure." I mean, we were inundated in that particular emergency with unaffiliated volunteers and goods. And so he went to town, and I was part of that process for 10 years, building and clarifying the infrastructure of the volunteer management system, integrating all the different agencies, trying to bring everybody to the table to have a streamlined system to incorporate volunteers into the entire state response. And so it was a privilege to be part of that, and we even wrote generic volunteer management training. So my point to you is, you're from many states on this call. If you are not familiar with the volunteer emergency response function in your state, each state has one. It comes out under your state's emergency response system department, and you'll see there that they classify different forms of response to an emergency. And in California, we're number 17, volunteers and donations. And so your state has a template in place. In New Hampshire, it's number 14. I don't know what it is in each of your states, but that's the first thing I would suggest you go do. to your state, just because it's interesting, and look at the Office of Emergency Services. Read the volunteer and donation section on your emergency response function, and then think about, well, how does that affect our hospital volunteers? And then that could be a point of conversation that you take back to your emergency manager and say, you know, I want to get more involved in this. What could we do differently in the future is the answer to that's what we're talking about now. How can we be using our hospital volunteers to their full capacity in the future rather than have them sitting home? That's the thing. So right now we're in COVID. It is, I understand, totally different. It's not a site disaster. It's a they had plans for pandemics, and I never saw volunteers sitting at home as part of his plans. So that means we didn't think of it.
Yeah, and let's actually get to the questions. There are a few questions. We've got about 35 minutes left. We want to make sure we have time for Q&A. But as Lisa pulls the poll up, go ahead, Jared, with your point.
Thank you. I just wanted to build on what Joan was saying regarding preparing with your volunteers and going ahead and asking those questions, looking into the state response and what they offer. I can tell you about a very well-intentioned program that hasn't worked out quite the way it was hoped for, and is very COVID-related. So there's a program called VSys. I know a lot more than I want to about it, but it stands for the Emergency System for Advanced Registration of Volunteer Health Professionals. The reason I bring it up is I'm not suggesting you have all your volunteers go sign up for VSys and send them away. That's not what I mean. It's good for you to know that, because if your hospital needs volunteers, just like New York did in April when the mayor or the governor, I can't remember who, got on and said, send your doctors here, send your nurses here. Wrong way to do it. Those are those SUVs, the spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers. We don't want them. We can't use them. It's illegal to drop a doctor into a hospital without privileges. There is a national system designed for that. I know it well because that's what I did in Maine for 5 years. And there's another resource called the Medical Reserve Corps. Usually these things are intertwined. The Medical Reserve Corps kind of strike units for response, and they're usually registered with the VSys program with the state, but maybe they only respond in their neighborhood. You could have your volunteers create a Medical Reserve Corps unit, have them register with the state, and then you've got your own emergency preparedness ready volunteers. The state will train them for free, as much training as they want. And we would have tons of people who would enter as a volunteer and leave as a professional volunteer or a professional disaster management person and get hired by the sheriff's department or the local, it's very valuable training. So it's a great opportunity for your volunteers to be preparing themselves for the bigger response. Now, in your hospital, you might have a request like, we're hurting, we need doctors right now. If you're aware of this program, you'll also know that you can call the state or call your local emergency manager and say, we need volunteers. Can you look into the state's VSys program? And their job is to find those doctors for you. And if the state has been doing their job, like I know California has and Maine has, there will be doctors ready to go. That their privileges have been waived because the insurance company is on hold because the state has declared an emergency. And so that's another role for you as a volunteer coordinator. If your volunteers aren't going to fit your needs right then, what other volunteers would? And registered state medical volunteers are a great resource to have on hand. Email me if you want more on that, because that's a whole other world of discussion, and I would love to tell you all about it. So email me. I put it in the chat, jmccannell@gmail.com.
Great. Thank you, Jared. And we're wrapping up our poll. We'll have the results shortly. And just for Lisa's sake, because she's doing such a great job with our driving the tech behind the scene of polls and putting the notes in the slides so all of us have this in the recording later, that, this panel is really opening up ideas, giving some good basic resources and ideas, and hearing back from you what some specific challenges might be as customers, and not only how VSys Voices can support you offline and add additional information, but we can, Jared and Joan, you can dig deep into this. These can be, 3-month classes if we really wanted to get to the nitty-gritty. So we understand that, time being what it is today, we're kind of planting some seeds, but absolutely feel free to reach out to your VSys Voices experts and, dig deeper into the resources that we share with you in this panel, and that will be appearing on the VSys Voices webpage shortly in the next couple of weeks for resources. So this is interesting because, one, this is typical of our sector, that we're not often enough at the strategic planning stage of something. And also seeing earlier the poll results that most of the people on the call today are in fact from hospitals, healthcare sector, where there's a plan and the volunteer coordinator or even director of volunteer services isn't always in the middle of that plan. That it looks like the majority either didn't have an answer or only a few are really a small percentage, maybe not quite even a quarter of our participants today have some sort of voice in the planning process, and that's great. We always want that to be as close to 100% for our leaders of volunteers having a seat at the table and a voice in the planning for disasters. Again, because we often have more headcount than almost anybody else, and there can be a role, even in tightly regulated sector such as healthcare, for everyone to play a really important, impactful role in what's unfolding. So that's not a surprising answer, but thank you for sharing. And hopefully with some of this information and also some of the managing up and other panels that we've had that are archived, you can start to see if and how you can get your voice added to that conversation for the structure in your agency, which might be a hospital for most of us talking today. Joan, did you want to speak to any of that, since that gets into your expertise as well?
Well, there's a couple things. One is most hospitals are already connected through their emergency response team to the healthcare professional resources for their states. Now, the question is, do you as a volunteer leader know what that is and how that works? You just should, because you just never know how you can help them acquire more medical professionals. However, that's nowhere that you want to go without the approval of your emergency manager. But the other thing is, I want to, Jared, do you want to talk about VOAD? Because we've talked about, the federal.
Yeah, I was going to bring up VOAD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think we're ready for that now, because there is a role for you at the local level. I've been surprised how many of my peers through COVID do not know about their local VOAD and have not been working with them over the years. It's something I always did. And so we thought we'd take this opportunity to, if you're not sure what a VOAD is, talk a little bit about it and what opportunity that could bring to the hospital or your organization.
Yeah, and while, yes, thank you, Joan. We're having a psychic moment of the next segue. And before you answer that, Jared, I just want to pull to attention those of you who can see the screen, who aren't just calling in and can participate in the polls. We have your organization's disaster recovery plans changed with COVID? Yes, no, or don't know. So that poll's going on while Jared fills us in on VOAD and Lisa takes notes on the slides for the archives. Go ahead.
Great. VOAD stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And let me give a great example. Joan had mentioned she worked with the Red Cross. Red Cross is often a VOAD member. Now, Red Cross usually has a major role in the response anyway. So I'll give you some other examples of, the typical VOAD type members. Salvation Army, their expertise during a disaster is feeding people. So they're an agency that they put what they're normally doing on hold or split their resources up, and they help respond. They always wait for that request, but they plan for it. They prepare for it. They've got the mobile trucks. They've got, the contracts with food providers or vendors, all that sort of stuff. And so they can mobilize to feed victims and survivors, or they can mobilize to feed responders. That's a good example. Salvation Army, Catholic Charities usually steps up to take a role, so on and so forth. Some of these national agencies that you're familiar with. But they have very specific roles predetermined and that they drill for, practice for, and they send a representative to the meetings they have, monthly or bi-monthly. So VOAD is something you might consider looking into. There's also something called National VOAD, and that's really just kind of an oversight agency that sends on best practices and resources to the local, state or local VOAD. You might also hear the acronym COAD, and that's Community Organizations Active in Disaster. That's just a variation of VOAD. It's the same thing, and it falls under the same oversight by the National VOAD. So that's what that is. Your hospital or agency could join your local VOAD and decide that, what, we we have our own needs, we have our own stuff, so we can't mobilize our staff, but we do have these volunteers. And so how could we, you could plan, how could we mobilize our volunteers to help out with the bigger picture? And it might be that, and this is something Joan's brought up in other meetings, it might be that your volunteers would be a great fit to staff, what the Salvation Army is doing with their staff. They do 2 or 3 days and then they're all burnt out, and then we can bring in your volunteers. Now, this can't happen during the event. This has to be something that is pre-planned, pre-designed. So if you don't know how you could help out during a disaster, go check out a VOAD meeting, see if it's the right fit for your agency, and let your superiors know that, I know during COVID, we can't have our volunteers kind of doing the things they might normally do. I'd love to partner with our local emergency response preparedness community to find out how we might be able to support in other ways with our resources. And so that's a nice way that you're not getting in the way of your own response with the professionals that are already involved with that, and you're engaging your volunteers in the name of your organization in a way that's not drawing away from your own response.
Exactly. Thank you, Jared. And that lines up perfectly with the poll results we just have that, again, not a surprising piece of data, but most people who we have more not answers, so even more than before, or don't know. So the majority of our participants today do not know or didn't answer if their agencies or organizations have made specific changes around COVID. A few have, literally 3, and that's great. And I also want to open up and remind everyone that this is interactive. We have great expertise. We have a lot of great information to share. And if you have a specific question, a specific challenge, a specific issue, or a success story, that please, if you can, put it in the chat, and we'll address that as well. Make sure that the voices in the room and what you're going through and what you've learned is also reflected in these sessions. As one of our priorities is VSys Voices. And I know in my work with both conservation and food security agencies, we've always had a part to play. So it's there's that saying, and Jared and Joan, I know you know this, that you train and you train and you train for something you hope you never have to do. Yep. But you run drills on it and it gets into that muscle memory, and you just hope that you never have to have like the giant earthquake response with, Project Open Hand providing meals to first responders and doctors and emergency people in addition to that. So I've had lots and lots of CERT, community emergency response training as an individual and with my agencies, and also sometimes called NERT, Neighborhood Emergency Response Training. So there's a lot of these acronyms, but the idea is that these resources absolutely already exist, and if you don't know your place in the response plan of your agency in this larger mechanism that gets kicked into place in local and state or federal emergencies, and that's absolutely something that you can learn and practice for. So seeing how those go with all of our nice acronyms. This is why we write these things out on the slides, because it's EVIT, VOAD, COAD, all of that, all HIPAA, all that stuff. Joan, we want to segue soon into also behavioral health, which Jared is going to talk about. Lisa, if you want to get to the behavioral health slide, that this is an important piece of it. But Joan, anything you want to add for being a piece in this process?
When it comes to sharing your volunteers, I think we have a full question about that later on. One of the issues I've encountered through COVID with hospitals is most of our volunteers are 65 and over, and they just want to stay home. And so I would like to suggest that there is still plenty for them to do, and you can find out what there is for them to do through going to VOAD and COAD and all the other different agencies that are part of the formal emergency response system. And one of the things you could do is post these types of mutual aid volunteer opportunities on your website for people in your groups that might want to still play a role in keeping your community safe. And one of the things they could be doing right off the top of my head is online tutoring.
Yep.
So that's one thing I wanted to add. Having your volunteers sit at home, I think, is no longer an option, and we really need to work together to help get them involved, because they are a trained workforce that you know, and they're full of resources and expertise. So the time has come now to take another look at that.
That's great. And again, this is recorded, so if you're on a phone call, you can come back and get an archived version of this later if you can't fully interact with the poll of the screens. We've got a poll up right now, and Jared's been putting links to some amazing resources in the chat. We're going to dig into those in a moment, but the poll question is, how aware are you of potential opportunities to share volunteers with other community organizations? And you share them on a regular part of it. We're starting to share in 2020 due to the crises. We would like to share but don't know how. We don't share because we're concerned about losing volunteers, otherwise known as poaching. Or the final answer being we don't share because it isn't possible for our organization. And again, getting into some of those tighter, more tightly regulated teams and places in the emergency response process, and not always having that flexibility even if the will is there. And of course, Jared's adding the point that the American Red Cross has wonderful trainings as well. So there's a lot of resources for you to get this information for individuals and agencies to get this training as well. So while they answer that poll question, this seems like a good time to shift into kind of behavioral health and what are the real community health after effects of dealing with this in your volunteers and in the community at large. So go ahead and dig into that, Jared, if you would, please.
Thank you. And this is another area that I'm very passionate about for a number of reasons. But when I was the state medical volunteer coordinator for Maine, our biggest and best and most active strike team, and half of our volunteers were behavioral health volunteers. So this is something that was just never even considered before 9/11. Mm-hmm. Not in the way that we needed it to be. The Red Cross has always been a rock when it comes to this one, but it was just one agency. Now, the federal government has taken this very seriously, and there are some wonderful resources. I tried to put them on the screen there. I might not have typed them perfectly right, but you can probably figure out, or at least do a search on phe.gov. SAMHSA is another one. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Mm-hmm. They put out the most material, the best material, most up-to-date, peer-reviewed stuff about disaster behavioral health. And one thing that every single one of your volunteers could do to be helpful during a disaster is go take behavioral health or disaster behavioral health first aid, or psychological first aid is also called, or in the Red Cross is mental health first aid. Take any one of them, whatever they call it. Take one of those behavioral health first aid classes, because you don't have to be a mental health professional to be compassionate, patient, caring, and helpful during a crisis. And that's what that training does. It taps into our own sense of altruism and our own sense of community, and gives you the proper tools to help out. Because during a disaster, when you have displaced people, they're in distress. And if they get even the most basic healthcare services and mental health care services in that first 24 to 48-hour period, their future success adjusting after that event, after the tragic event, is like a million, I'm guesstimating here, 1,000,000 times better.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to keep in mind. Every single state has someone there that does the training. Right now, most states are doing it all online. There's sometimes a cost to it, but it's usually always absorbed by the county or state or other federal resource. So that's something you can check out. Behavioral health resources for disasters, psychological first aid, or mental health first aid. The links I put on the screen, each one of them has resources for that. Now, the other thing I want to throw out there, and then open up the space for other folks to share, is every hospital I've ever known participates in something called the Hospital Preparedness Program. Now, I've only ever worked with hospitals that receive federal money in one form or another. But basically, there's been a whole movement to build these coalition of healthcare and hospital organizations, so that when a disaster strikes, you can move resources around the state by having these channels already set up. And so it's worth checking out with whoever it is that's the emergency management person at your hospital or your agency. Hey, are we part of a healthcare coalition for disasters? And if not, that might be something you can start to look into for them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, Jared. And our poll question, kind of interesting answer. It's a little surprising that no one's sharing volunteers. And so this is why we're on this conversation, is I think, there's been a lot of curiosity and like, how do we even do this? Where do we start? It can be overwhelming when we're already in the midst of several crises or under a lot of stress to try to sort this out. So again, this is the beginning of some seedlings of ideas and resources and the beginnings of having these conversations, and there's always more to dig deeper into. So yeah, only a couple people would even consider sharing volunteers, and most people don't answer, they just don't know. So again, these are the answers you can find within your agency of how volunteers might fit into sharing and caring in the community. Or again, it's just valuable sometimes to encourage volunteers to get this individual mental health support training and CERT and NERT training just to have as very useful skills, whether or not that's specific with your agency. So kind of looking at this resource page, the overall theme we're getting today is prepare, prepare, prepare. Prepare in the quiet times, prepare in the eye of the storm, prepare and train and practice and hope that you never have to use it, but at least when something happens, you're ready. And that kind of gets into our next poll question, which is, have you been involved with any of these things? And you have the chance to select multiple answers. Have you been involved with disaster recovery planning, disaster behavioral health, mental health support, DOVIAs, Directors of Volunteers and Agencies, our National Professional Association, ALIVE, your state office of volunteers, like California Volunteers for our West Coast example, but there's many in each state, Medical Reserve Corps, voluntary organizations active in disaster, VOAD, as we've talked about, ESAR VIP, Emergency System for Advanced Registration of Volunteer Health, and Lisa, you might actually have to scroll. Let's see if I can, I can scroll, or any others that we haven't covered yet. And Jared just added to the chat, DBH, Disaster Behavioral Health. So again, a lot of acronyms, a lot of agencies, a lot of training opportunities kind of being presented here. And take the time to sort through this, to absorb it, to let it sink in. Joan, as we're getting our polls answered, Joan, did you want to add in with anything that you think is specific to involvement in these different agencies or programs?
Well, the hospital group, I would state the fact that our volunteers are sidelined, and I have to attribute that to the fact that we may, or we are, if we are involved with this group, we're in good time, it wasn't in the right way or not enough. And so now, my peers, Dana and Jared, have heard me say again and again, what are we going to do? What could we have done better? How are we going to rewrite our policies and procedures? Where are we going to go to lead us out of this COVID situation and to rebuild our communities? And so in my mind, and very much on paper now, there are strategies we can put in place to rearrange our agencies and our volunteers and reapportion where people are volunteering or can volunteer or are needed now. And that includes your hospital volunteers. And that requires astute leaders to be able to manage those kind of processes and to sit on those types of committees in your community. The starting place is this list right here. So if you need to ask permission of your emergency manager to start exploring your hospital, or you personally, or even you as a citizen, and do it on your own time, want to get involved in these agencies, now's the time, because what's past is past. We've got to start rebuilding.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joan. So, Lisa,
yeah, Joan, thank you. I couldn't say it better myself.
Yeah, let's pull up the polling answers, because I'm really curious to see the distribution and the folks that are on this panel, because each call is going to be different. It's going to be a different bunch of participants and clients each time. And again, you know, most of the people, pretty much all the people on the call, they're either involved with something other, and if you can type into the chat what the other is, please do that with your name. But most people don't answer, and they're not involved with any of this yet. So I would say, think about getting involved with one of these. There's you know, joining something. Alive has communities of practice in healthcare and it's just a great professional resource. There's also professional resources for specific, just like there's a specific certification of CAVs for hospital and healthcare volunteer expertise. There's also specific professional associations that are kind of within that silo because it is special, but the General Professional Association for America is ALIVE, Association of Leaders in Volunteer Engagement, and there is a community of practice that specializes in healthcare and talks about those issues. So it sounds like with these poll answers, this is the perfect session to have right now to introduce all of you to these ideas. And Scott, you bring up a good point that you're not sure if focusing outside of the institutions is useful, but these are great resources. And that's, you know, we're putting these out there as, again, seeds and seedlings. Sometimes they're going to grow into great trees of ideas, and it's going to be really useful. And other times it's going to be something that you're already doing, but certainly this is a moment in our global history to address how we prepare for crises, and particularly around volunteerism. And so one of our final poll questions is, are you aware that volunteer hours and efforts may qualify for emergency funding from FEMA, Community Development Block Grants, Pittman-Robertson Act, which is around conservation, so I'm pretty familiar with that. Others, and type in the chat if you've had some other grants or foundations or government programs reimbursement. Or E, our favorite answer whenever there's a poll or a Scantron, I was not aware of any of these. So please take a few moments to answer that. And Joan and Jared, jump back in with your thoughts.
Joan, go ahead.
I'm still pondering the reply that the hospital volunteer group, you know, really should be still focused internally. When I say this on some calls, they've just shut my screen off, but I'm going to say it on this call and see if they shut my screen off. We won't cut you off, Joan.
Go ahead.
I've said this back in March, and it has come to pass. Looking at the landscape, I don't see hospital volunteerism ever being what it was again in the future. I don't see us sitting on hundreds and hundreds of active volunteers in our organizations any longer. I see volunteerism being dispersed out into the community agencies that the hospitals are partnering with for social determinants of health. And that's where, and I see even some hospitals in the Bay Area have done that now. The director of volunteers for the hospital, a major hospital in the Bay Area, is the link not only to the internal volunteers, but to all the external partnerships the hospital has regarding social determinants of health. So that wall of huge numbers of volunteers working internally within a hospital has come down. And so now we're going to live through what will be rebuilt by the hospital. And that's why so many of your volunteers are still sitting home. They're not coming back into the hospital. They are going to be rebuilt or incorporated into a system that is being built, not even dealing with them right now. we'll allow volunteers in once the new hospital organization management system is rebuilt around COVID. So while we're waiting for that, my advice is get people working to get our country back on its feet again. And suck it up, be creative, be innovative, be brave, be informed, and go out and get your volunteers working some way or another. If they're in a hospital, which is doubtful, so then go to plan B.
Yeah, and that's good. And it's important to not just think very creatively and proactively right now and not just sit and wait like, oh, I have to sit and wait for someone to tell me. Yeah, some of the time you do, but you can also come up with your own ideas and show your own professional leadership in suggesting these things and coming up with these innovations and then seeing like, can I get it? Can I put it up the flagpole and see how this works in the rest of the organization, even when you're in a government agency or a hospital setting that's very tightly regulated. That one person knew that FEMA funds were available and everybody else was.
That was me.
Yeah, that was Jared. Jared, you're throwing off the results, man. You're skewing the bar.
I skipped the other ones, but I couldn't help it.
We had to have one yes. But these resources exist. And again, even in times of crisis, tumultuous times, politically times of transition or uncertainty, like these are solid programs that it kind of exists no matter what else is going on. So these are there for you. And we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that, we've put a lot of information out there. Again, use it as you will, dig deeper into it. There's a lot to go over. It may or may not apply to you in each situation. And for Scott gets the participation trophy or he's got the best access to the chat box today. So thank you, Scott, for coming early and participating a lot in the chat. If there's any other questions, we want to have you put those in the chat or let us know. And again, feel free to contact VSys itself to get in touch with us. Jared's email has been up there. Lisa's email is up there, and you should all have that in your little address book communicating with her on a regular basis for the software. But there's a lot. And sometimes the biggest barrier to changes is external. We get that. It's structural. But I'm going to challenge everybody. I'm going to invite you, not even challenge, I'm going to invite you to look at what are your biases and assumptions. Are you absolutely certain that there isn't a slightly creative, different thing that can be done to keep that volunteer engagement going? Because again, to Joan's point, which we've been saying this, and she's particularly been saying this, not just in these panels, but others since COVID really hit us hard in March in the States, that any institution that keeps engagement in any form, online, letters, phone calls, check-ins, has kept up engagement, that's where you're going to get a good return of your talent pool coming back to serve in whatever capacity is appropriate within the pandemic and afterwards and what the world looks like then. And the institutions that just shut down and didn't have good communication and didn't tell their staff or furloughed volunteer leading staff, they're going to have a harder time coming back up to functionality with their full team. And if you've not engaged properly with your volunteer talent or communicated transparently and honestly and directly with them in this time, that's a lot of talent that just goes somewhere else, that does go where they're needed in the community. So we want to kind of hammer home that messaging in all of these panels, that keeping that engagement consistent in whatever way you can. And honest, even if there's not much to update, saying, hey, we're just checking in with everybody, that can be the difference between who stays engaged with your organization when you can have them in a position or a role or a task or a duty again, and who just drifts off into the wind and, does something really, really different or completely disengages from your organization. I've got just a couple of minutes. Scott's saying weekly emails to volunteers. That's a great thing to do. WebEx town halls, listening sessions, sometimes just listening, and social things. Alive's done wonderful things for our members where we have virtual online ice cream socials, or playing bingo or having virtual karaoke nights. There's a lot of goofy social things that are just fun to do. Last week in Halloween, a lot of costume contests online and pet parades. So even when things are social, even if it's not mission critical, that's still a great way to keep that engagement and connection to the mission of your agency. And Jared, you want to have a final, Jared and Joan, each a final wrap-up thought?
I'm just going to repeat what I just typed. I've heard it said a million times, you know, failure to prepare is prepared to fail, or failure to plan is planning to fail. You know, it's not quite that black and white, but it's pretty decent advice. And if I could do two things, if I was a hospital volunteer coordinator, you know, I would go ahead and say, hey, volunteers, take this online training. It's free. It's really helpful if they ever want to get into a career of volunteer management, which most people can rise to the level of master's degree without paying a cent. If you want to be a preparedness professional in America, it's a great field to get into, especially with your background. You know, I would have them take that ICS 100 class just so they understand how an incident is managed, whether it's internally or externally, so that's valid for both. And I would have them take psychological first aid because your doctors and nurses and other healthcare practitioners are going to be burnt out. And having your own volunteers be able to be a shoulder to cry on or available with real training under their if they're not licensed people.
Yep.
It's proved built. So
yep.
that across the board will be good.
Excellent. Joan, we're pretty much out of time. You got any little soundbite of advice?
I want to urge everybody on the call to be not afraid.
Yep, be not afraid.
Be not afraid.
Yep.
You may be afraid to do these outreach or have things or take these steps to reactivate your volunteers elsewhere. Don't be afraid. You may be afraid of losing your job. Be brave. We've been through so many changes and so many transitions. In fact, the people that will make it through are the ones that are taking steps that seem almost outlandish at the time, but it meets the needs of the day. And that's what I'm urging you to do. Meet the needs of the day. The volunteers that you're waiting to bring back to reactivate, their jobs after your hospitals are finished their rebuild, and they're all in the process of it now, may not be there anyway.
Yeah.
And so just don't be afraid. Educate yourself. And think about this. Talk to your internal emergency management leaders about how post-COVID you can work with them more closely to incorporate volunteers into your hospital's emergency response plans in the future.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks, everyone, for taking an extra minute or two. There's a lot of information to go over. We're doing these December. We're going to do something a little more social, so watch for news on that. But thank you for joining us again. Feel free to reach out. We, as VSys Voices, are all here for you on this topic and others, and you've got Lisa's contact information right there. So thanks. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us and the work that you do. Okay.